rise and shine. Pour yourself a cup of coffee and tune in to Good Morning Aurora. News, weather, and really cool interviews. Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m.
We're here with dear friend Sandra Gonzalez of the Rapid Response Team.
Yes, and today I'm wearing my PhD hat.
PhD hat is on today. And we have Nick Thompson of the City of Aurora.
Yeah, no hats.
No hats. But off of a successful Social Justice Committee meeting last night. Was it last night?
It was. It was excellent. A lot of engagement, and I think I learned a bit, and I think more people should come out to those.
Awesome. All right, so take us away. What are we talking about today?
So we are going to be talking about critical race theory. We're going to be dispelling some myths, some misunderstandings, especially given that it's definitely a hot button topic today.
Right. All right, so for those unfamiliar with critical race theory, I think it'd be best just to start off, briefly, in a brief description. What is it, since we hear so much about it today?
Sure. So critical race theory is actually an academic concept that's more than 40 years old. It's not something new. It's actually an ideal, a lens of viewing the social construct that is race. And not just because out of racism or discrimination, but also something that is embedded in the systems that we see today. It came largely out of critical legal studies, out of the legal field, and there were many scholars in the 70s and 80s at that time that felt that we needed to do more to further break down, what are some of those inequities, especially as it relates to race, as it pertains to Black people in particular. And so out of that, one of the most notable scholars, Kimberly Crenshaw, coined the term critical race theory in an effort to start looking at how is it that race is embedded in our society, how does it reflect some of the privileges or not that people benefit from. And so to boil it down, really, it's really questioning how much it is that our systems benefit or not from some of the levels of privilege and also the racial constructs that we see today in the U.S.
Wonderful. So how will we, what will our discussion, what's next? What's our first area or topic, or we have questions?
Sure, so I have been doing a lot of research around this, so just a little bit of background about my program. I am a PhD student at Illinois State, so I'm currently studying educational administration and foundations. However, what's unique about my program is that our foundation is critical race theory in education. So one of the first things that I want to dispel is that there are many conversations and dialogues around, well, you can't study it in K-12, and this is something that's been going on, since Trump left office, and trying to dispel that this is something that isn't a curriculum. It's, again, another lens to look at. However, like I said, it's something that really lets us look at how it is that these constructs of race and ethnicity are implicating what we see today. And so I think that largely trying to look at that from that lens, and then also just boiling it down to what it really means and what it isn't. So that's what we're going to look at.
Awesome. Nick, what are your feelings on critical race theory?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think it's been interesting to see, and I'm going to take a different approach to what I think the conversation critical race theory has been, because I think dispelling the myths is important, but also being aware of why it is now a hot topic issue. I genuinely believe most of these people don't care about what critical race theory is. I think from the interviews I've seen and the debates that I've seen, most of them are incapable of naming a critical race scholar, which suggests you haven't read it, so you are opposed to something you know nothing about. So then that leads me to believe that you have other ulterior motives for evoking critical race theory. I think it's being used as a political battering ram currently, and to galvanize the Republican base for 2022. Since Trump left office, when he made the declaration that, cultural and sensitivity training must be removed and all those things, now there's been a conflation of critical race theory. These are more culture wars, right? And I think in the conversation I'll bring it up later, it's very similar to the McCarthy era, and there's a lot of lines of parallel that I can draw between anti-communism, critical race theory, and critical race theory currently, and how they're just used as political tools to galvanize the base and be very divisive. So I don't think there's a genuine discourse taking place. There are people who are confused on critical race theory who are probably on the fence, or like they're not Republican or Democrat, they're just hearing the word, and I think we should dispel the myth for them. But I don't think the right has any interest in truly understanding it currently.
Dog whistle politics.
Exactly.
Nothing but just the red meat as we hear about.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit.
Right.
And yeah.
This is why I wanted to have Nick here, because he's gonna aid in that, the cynicism behind CRT as well, and just how it's just being conflated, like he said, to this. It's almost like that era of the Red Scare, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who's associated with CRT and its practice is being equated to the level of being a communist or to that nature. And we want to make sure that people understand that this has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, we've seen those signs. Race mixing equals communism.
Yeah.
Blacks in our schools. It's kind of interesting what one can be called a communist for.
Right.
Wow. Treadwell is coming. It's just sad. It's really sad. It's really sad. Yeah. No, it is important. And to Nick's point, those who are already opposed to it but can't articulate why, we're not going to save them. They can't be converted. Most likely, they can't be. For those who are on the fence and interested, pertinent information will definitely benefit them.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
All right. So what's topic number one? Let's take it.
So I think one of the biggest myths out there that I've been hearing pop up is that critical race theory is, the point of it is to make white people, in particular if it's being taught in schools, it's going to make white children feel guilty about being white, and that they are the biggest culprits of what's going on. And so that in and of itself is a myth. Critical race theory is not, it wasn't designed with the intent to cause any guilt in white people. It was designed to really analyze how is it that these systems perpetuate that Eurocentric, that ideals that go along with, for example, perpetuating enslavement. How does that manifest itself, and who does it implicate? Who does it benefit and who does it not? Criticizing also how it is that there are certain levels of access that people have just based off of their level of education, for example, or their access to housing, and also other services that are provided by either the government or the private sector. So it all has to do with, yes, it has to do with people who benefit from whiteness, but it's not necessarily have to be a white person who only benefits from that access or those privileges. So to say that, we're trying to make white people feel guilty is actually far from it. We're trying to get them to be more aware of how is it that they currently benefit from these systems. How is it that they have more access as opposed to, say, someone who comes from Black, Indigenous, even Asian Pacific Islander communities, where they might be more discriminated against or antagonized due to just their appearance. But it's also boiling down to as well, just in education, for example, we're trying to make it so that critical race theory being embedded in historical context allows for even students who are white to see what it is that having this critical history and also being able to analyze from a lens that's more productive, and also from a lens that is of social justice, bringing that piece in, having them to be able to have the tools to analyze that without the guilt being there. And so that's one of the biggest myths out there, is that we're blaming white people, that we're blaming white children for essentially their existence, when that's far from the truth. It's giving them that other lens to say, hey, this is what knowledge you do not have, this is the gap that we need to fill, so that way you're able to see what else is it that you're missing out? And it's to the benefit of white children, of white people, and also our students of color and the communities of color.
How do you feel about that?
I agree 100%, and I would echo that the misconception is also, it's turned on its head. Critical race theory is pushing back against, right, race as a biological fact. It is the opposite of biological determinism and biological essentialism. What it's saying is we are more likely influenced by the structures, environments, and upbringings, which creates preferential power and provides privileges and access to other groups of people, in particular in this conversation, white people. And so it's not saying because you are white, you were born white by virtue of some essence. What it's saying is we exist in a superstructure, right? A structure and culture that is producing these situations. So I think oftentimes they're saying, oh, so because I'm white, I am immediately racist. You're misunderstanding that, right? It's actually the opposite. It's pushing back against these ideas of like early race science that people by nature of their race have some particular essence or lack intelligence. It's
Eugenics.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
and what's very similar to, I always bring this up, it's very similar to the fact that, and it's because this is all resting upon false premises and misunderstandings, it's reason why most conservatives misunderstand like gender and sex and conflate those two as well, because they usually start from the premise of biological essentialism, that male and female and masculinity and femininity are just inherent to when you're born, right? We aren't saying that. We're saying gender is a social construct, such as race and racialism, right? They are constructs, not biological facts.
I think there's a typical rebuttal that I've heard, maybe you guys have heard it as well, before critical race theory, when issues of race come up, and it's most predominantly used by, white people, that, I'm not responsible for what happened in 1631. So why would people feel blame if they're not responsible for 1631? The blame that we're talking about, I understand it, but I find that strange to understand from an outside looking in perspective.
I think in that moment when people are first starting to just be able to analyze how it is that they, in these systems, are to benefit or to essentially perpetuate this system of whiteness.
Right.
I think that sometimes it is a little bit of a shock for people because they're being asked to drastically change what it is that they've grown up with this entire time. That's not to say that they should be absolved of any responsibility, and yes, they weren't responsible for, coming for their ancestors, or if they have any linkage to that they are, that's this settler colonialist type of system that we see today. However, we do have to take a step back and also explain that even though they aren't directly tied to that manifestation of the systems we see today, they still benefit from it, they still perpetuate it without really analyzing, if I continue to further these systems because they benefit me but not anyone else, what does that say about the way in which I navigate these systems? And so it's not a matter of, well, you're at fault because you continue to uphold whiteness and also perpetuate systems in which continue to further further inequities that exist between white people and also people of color. However, I think it's a matter of explaining them to and reiterating that while they have no tie to that, it's still a matter of, your race in the context of the U.S. and as society has constructed it, you continue to benefit from these things, and if you do not acknowledge that, then we can't really go about starting to question these systems if we still have people walking around who just continue to be able to perpetuate this but don't give it much thought. And that's what we're essentially trying to say too, is that if we know that it's by no means your creation, however, you're continuing to uphold it and you're not questioning it.
I agree. Well said. Well said.
Very well said.
All right. So we have another part. Okay.
So the other part of it too is that people seem to think that critical race theory is something that is, it's meant to teach about white people being explicitly racist. And so we kind of touched on that too, about how, critical race theory isn't meant to just blatantly say that all white people are racist. Like, as we mentioned a little bit before, we were talking about, how is it that we're going about recognizing that, like Nick mentioned before, race isn't biological. It's something that was constructed out of many, many centuries of, colonization, out of driving people out of lands, out of essentially wielding a system that is Eurocentric in a capacity that has yet manifested into education, into the way that we see our carceral systems today. And then we talk about how, people end up in these systems and don't want to acknowledge that they might be biased as well. Bias does come along with racism. And so essentially saying that CRT is just to call out white people, to tell them that they're racist, that's not what the point of it is at all. It's to help people start thinking about, what are some of the biases that they have ingrained in their mind? What are some of the things that, maybe subconsciously they have yet to explore? And this even goes for people of color, because we talk about how we need to have representation in spaces, but we don't talk about how also people of color can benefit from these systems and also perpetuate whiteness. And yes, there's something to be said about that too, but we're not here to just say people are racist and then leave it at that. It's to provide dialogue and get them to think about more, where does this stem from? How is it that some of this has been internalized, and then try to also create change among people, even if it's, a little bit at a time too.
I have an opinion about that, but before I give my opinion about it, what do you think about what Sandra just shared with us?
Yeah, I would say I agree with what she's saying, and I also will add some context too. So, one of the early influencing thought leaders on critical race theory is actually Derek Bell. And as she said earlier, it came out of legal studies. One thing that I think will help provide people some clarity is understanding that he had 3 concepts that he introduced into critical legal studies, and one of them was the interest convergence principle. And essentially what that suggested, and on its face, I think most people can say, yeah, and essentially what it is, it's saying that black people in America could not achieve civil rights unless black and white interests converge, that black people on their own were not going to receive anything unless it aligned with white interests as well. I think if we look at, and I'm not going to bore people with history, but if we look at the civil rights movement, if we look at anything post that, anti-lynching movements, even the abolition of slavery, on its own, just being moral towards black people was not what achieved that. They were not, it was never, it had to always have some economic or political interest for white people as well for those progresses to be made. Absolutely. So what he's saying now, and with these principles, because he had 3 of them, he's saying, he's looking at law and how law, and he did not believe that it was objective or that there was judicial neutrality, right? That the law is not some objective force being applied to people, that in fact, when we look at data and sentencing and harsher sentencing, people of darker skin are receiving harsher sentencing. So critical race theory and legal study, when it's coming together, it's trying to better understand why that is, because these aren't biological facts, but racialization from, as what Sandra told us, right, that was devised to justify subjugation, exploitation, and the enslavement of a group of people, has still existing in different forms in the way that we see how laws are applied, how we see the economies run, right? Where why are black people just, when you look at groups of black people, they're most likely to be unhoused, most likely to face food insecurity, and the next decade coming, they are going to have a collective wealth of 0. Why is that?
Right.
Now, it's not biological facts of they're lazy. Now, that's what some people would like you to believe, but there are social and political, right, realities and circumstances that are causing this. how do we analyze this properly to say, well, why are black people on the losing end of every social, political, and economic kind of situation? So that's kind of what it is. It has little to do with making you feel guilty, though people do benefit from the past, right? And if we are inactive, or sometimes our actions uphold those systems, well, then you are, right? This is an indictment on you, and we have to have some reflective, right? And this is what I'll end it on. Anybody claiming to want to have a unified America, some unified union, I won't even put my opinion on that, but if that's what you claim that you want to have, you'd have to take race seriously. You'd have to take the inequality seriously, because you're never going to be able to create that perfect union when a large population is occupied, essentially. A large population is on the losing end economically, politically, and socially. You have a large groups of people who are massively imprisoned, dying by the hands of the state, whether directly or indirectly, right? You're not creating a perfect union, because there will continually be cleavages and disruptions to that system, and eventually it is not sustainable. So I would always ask people, if you really want this, the so-called, liberal democracy, it is not sustainable in the subjugation of people, and that is internationally too, I'd go, but that's a different conversation.
I think we're also in this, this culture of cancel culture right now, where people are getting just essentially targeted for past actions or past writings where they may be racist in nature. And of course, we need to acknowledge and also validate that those are experiences that have occurred, and also make sure that we are having dialogues around, well, why is this something that is racist? Why is it discriminatory, and where does this come from, right? And that's essentially where we need to get deeper into our own biases and question, our where is it that we've gotten these messages? How is that socially constructed versus, there's the aspect of, what is it that our personal experiences have led us to believe and say and do certain things that also implicate us in this racist nature. And so while, yes, it can be a good thing to essentially have people be acknowledging of their own racism, we also have to come from a place where we have to start having dialogues around it. We can't just leave people hanging, because I think so often too is what happens is that people, when they hear the word of being racist, it does fuel a lot of things, a lot of emotions in people, and to just leave it at that can also stir a lot of actions that what we're seeing today is the attack on education, the attack on what it means to abolish certain systems, what it means to dismantle or defund, and having these conversations around, well, for example, if we want to abolish prisons, people are running around and saying that, well, if we do this, then you're letting, quote unquote criminals go, but that's not really what it is. It's that we're talking about, well, why do we feel the need to incarcerate people who also overwhelmingly tend to be black and brown people? Why is that there? And so you have to also think about too, if we're going to call out people for their racism, we also have to call them back in and ask them, where are these sentiments coming from? Where is this going? What is it that your beliefs are, and how is it that we can deconstruct that to further have conversations? Because again, we're in this, I think we're so used to now in these last 5-6 years, I would argue, where we've been calling people out, but we haven't been calling them in and asking them really deeply about where is all of this coming from. And I think too, that's where critical race theory comes in, is that, like we said before, it's not just there as a tool to make people feel guilty. It's about analyzing the systems of which people navigate, sometimes blindly, and having to have them question, how is it that they benefit from them? And yes, there are people that are racist, but we also have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what are the experiences that have led them to believe these things? What are some of the more emotionally pressing things that makes them react in this way? So, it's also being proactive to the reactive is what I would say.
But don't we know already? Aren't we aware of what the specific reason is? Hasn't European and Anglo-Saxon literature alone, the thinkers and the enlightened, haven't they already let us know what they think? Was it not Abraham Lincoln who said that if it were possible to bring peace to the Union and not free slaves, he would do that? And he certainly thought that Negroes were less than white. So I wonder, don't we already know that? Haven't we been reading, what the status and opinion of African Americans is in Romania? So aren't we aware of the writings of Christian thinkers and Lutheran thinkers in American history as to what we, the children of Ham, are in American context? I wonder, I feel like we already know. I could be.
Do we know?
I think that I've always been an advocate of large number, I've been an advocate of people of color becoming familiar with European literature. European literature and the history of Mormonism in America has been rife with, and I believe, in my opinion, that it has been the breeding ground, the combination of religious dogma kind of pressed into a sandwich of bigotry. The statues of revered Klan figures that many people don't want taken down, and their dedication to white supremacy. So I have been of the opinion that white people in America have made it clear through the religious backing and underpinning what they think of people of color. And that's why we have the systems that we have. I agree wholeheartedly with critical race theory, but I just would like to encourage anyone, read Kipling, read Brigham Young, church leaders, people of faith, who have consistently stressed to their progeny, to their generations, that African Americans are cursed, hence the dark skin, and they're going to hell. So we have to have these, we can't live next to them. The highway must, many things that we're talking about, which have permeated American life and created what we see today. That's my opinion. But, I could be wrong. I could be.
So, do you want to say something?
I will say, for the record, I'm not familiar with religious texts or, for that matter, church texts or really any sort of text, just because of my own experiences with religion. And I would say, as for me, when I look at that and I think about just the history of religion in relation to Black people, indigenous peoples, even throughout for me, looking at Latin America and also the U.S., I think there's just such a history of wielding, in particular, Protestantism and Catholicism as a tool of indoctrination with communities of color, in particular, where especially where that indigeneity, the practice of their culture, gets lost. That's why also I think that we also have to, using critical race theory as a lens, like I said, it's one of many social justice lenses out there. It just happens to be the one that's in the limelight right now. is another way of also deconstructing, some of the experiences that we've been talking about, also deconstructing some of, because religious texts are there, they serve as, bringing about faith, but also they can be interpreted and misinterpreted at the same time. As I've seen in historical context in terms of religious texts being wielded to essentially being propagandized, being used as a tool to make people subservient. And so I think that that's also where critical race theory comes in, is looking at some of these texts and also looking at how it is that they're being wielded and how it is that they have been part of many tools in oppressing and colonizing, especially people of color in this history, in the context of the U.S., Native American people, Black people, throughout that period of enslavement. And even, I would argue that even enslavement hasn't ended. It's been perpetuated and manifested into what we see today. The carceral system is a manifestation of that. Even arguably public education, for example, when we are not allowing certain types of curriculum that really delve into the ethnic histories that make up what is the U.S. today, we're doing a disservice to students and communities. And essentially, I remember 10 years ago, there were debates over ethnic studies. And it falls, ethnic studies on its own is another lens and also another way of looking at how it is that we deconstruct that construct of race and ethnicity, especially in the U.S., but also can be used in tandem with critical race theory to essentially bring about some of those histories that we don't see today, and that is inclusive of how it is that religion is wielded as a tool, because again, in the historical context, we've seen that where we see Christianity in relation to people of color has so often been to, make it so that they are much more quote-unquote civilized, for example. And so that's where I see it and how that stands. But again, in the context of critical race theory, looking at that type of context and essentially asking, how is it that we've used these texts to really rid people of their cultures, to rid people of some of the customs that they have gone about practicing, and also asking ourselves too, how does that lend itself to some of the systems of whiteness that we see today?
I might have cut you off earlier before.
I know, because I asked her, I wanted to see what she had to say. I try to be as brief as possible. What I'll say to it is I have complicated thoughts on religion, but generally what I try to say is that I try to judge ideologies, practices, schools of thought, and philosophy, and religion falls under that, as their principles, not how they get utilized or misapplied. I think Christianity has, in most Abrahamic faiths, oftentimes are easily perverted and made a mockery, but if we subscribe to their tenets, I actually hold a great deal of, I associate with them. Though I'm an agnostic, and that is because of just more institutional purposes,
Sure.
I actually hold a lot in them. From each according to ability to each according to need is all throughout Abrahamic faith, right? The idea that we should end poverty, the idea we should take care of our neighbors, right? It actually, to me, is not compatible with conservatism because it's highly individualistic, and it actually believes in hierarchy, and religion doesn't believe in hierarchy other than God, right? So, and this is related to critical race theory, and I'll try to dwell into this quickly, right? Like early conservative thought leaders like Edmund Burke, right? At the fall of the aristocracy, he said, how can we maintain power? And he said, and he wrote a very interesting book, and he said the way that we can maintain power and still hold up hierarchy, because they believe inherently that hierarchy should exist, was through the free market. It's not lost on me that we see racialization come through this idea that there are people who need to be subjugated and used for labor. Right? So then you look at the racialization, because the master-slave relationship was a cause of racism, not the result of racism. It was the cause of racism. And then it turned into this beast of its own, where now it's used oftentimes politically to racialized groups of people to point at like economic downshifts, right? And I'll get real quickly. You can look at like immigrants being scapegoated, right? They took your job. No, your job was sent overseas by a corporation, right? And we see this time and time again, that you cannot disaggregate the economic and the race, right? Class and race are intertwined and they're always working together, right? And their racialization, again, is not biological, it's social, right? It's social. So when I think about religion, and I take it back to that and bring it full circle, for me, I don't write it off completely, but I look at the purpose of why it was used, right? Oftentimes being used as a colonial tool to justify that we are civilizing these people, to justify the land theft, right? And in critical race theory is opposed to this idea that property is more important than justice. And it's not lost on me that there were groups of people who were property and that the whole foundation of the Western world is built on land theft.
Right.
Right? It's not just Native Americans here, but other indigenous populations that had their land stolen and other populations that were subjugated, right? Based upon these ideas of race, right? Whether it's in the Caribbean or in the other parts of the Americas, there are always indigenous people that had their land stolen, and then there are groups of people who were then subjugated into enslavement.
Right.
And it's always economic, and it's always has something to do with labor, right? It's always there, and it's very hard to kind of, remove that. And I think critical race theory is a lens and a way to kind of demystify and kind of come to a clearer understanding of why does race still haunt us when it isn't a biological fact? Why is it still here? What is its purposes? And how have we constructed society around it? So.
All right. Next part. That was very well said.
Thank you.
That was very well said.
So I think for the sake of time, there's something that is, very local that is happening right now. And there's this confusion around CRT, so the acronym of it. And there's critical race theory, which we've delved a lot into, but then people don't realize that, in the last decade that, there's been this movement around making sure that we are not only teaching relevant curriculum, but that we're also making efforts to make sure that the curriculum is representative of the students that sit in our classrooms. And so what happened in this last year was actually the state of Illinois passed a bill to make sure that teacher licensure programs are embedding in their curriculums culturally relevant teaching and learning. And about that are standards to ensure that, what are we doing to ensure that all of our students are accounted for, that their personal experiences, their lived experiences are validated through the curriculum. What are we doing to make sure that we are sensitive towards the cultures that are represented in our classrooms, and also making sure that we are being, we are acknowledging that this is something that, students also have a say in. How is it that it is being student facilitated, in addition to how is it that our educators are going about making sure that they are continuously growing and developing on their own, how it is that their biases are implicated in these curriculums. And so essentially what is there is not CRT, critical race theory.
Right. It just so happens to have the same acronym.
It happens to have the same acronym, and for folks that will be tuning in for the first time, my background is that I used to teach high school Spanish for 5 years, and then I left teaching, and so now I'm a doctoral student and doing a bunch of different things, but I say it so that people aren't, questioning, well, where is this lady coming from?
Right.
But I can say that from being in a content area where we had to continuously be making sure that our curriculum was culturally relevant, especially where, we're talking about languages, and not to mention that Spanish is also a colonizer's language, because we forget that the Spaniards also came and colonized areas of what is now the U.S. prior to England coming and colonizing other areas. We
Places
also have
like
to remember,
Florida.
yes, like Florida, and also what is now Mexico and California
Mhm.
and Texas, and so we forget about that aspect. But you know, making sure that students are aware of that, and making sure that our educational staff are also you know, continuously developing their awareness around, you know, what is cultural sensitivity, how do we acknowledge the experiences in this, whereas, you know, with critical race theory, it's getting more at the analysis and the being able to break down, you know, what is racism, what does this look like, what are the social constructs behind it, and I think that's a big difference too when we talk about the other buzzwords are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will say this too, I have my master's in education in diversity and equity. And so, you know, with that, we so often don't hear about, you know, in these conversations around equity and inclusion, what are we doing to be anti-racist?
Right.
And that is, yes, that also goes well with critical race theory, but that can also stand alone with, you know, other literature out there supporting how is it that we're deconstructing race. And so anti-racist education has also fallen in tandem with culturally responsive teaching. And so they lend themselves well, and I think that's where people are getting confused, is that you can have culturally responsive teaching without having the lens of critical race theory. And you can use any social justice lens to uphold culturally responsive teaching and learning, but the fact of the matter is that people are conflating the two and are essentially getting them confused. One, because they have the same acronym, and two, because, as Nick mentioned at the beginning, people don't know what CRT is, or they don't care to learn what it is, and so it's being essentially made bigger than what it is, and aren't looking into, well, what is the difference between the two, because they don't know.
What do you think?
I agree, you know, and to echo critical race theory again, what I'll say is there are people, there's academic disputes about it that are happening in the academy. There is this cultural discourse that's taking place, and then I think there is this other aspect of people who are just genuinely confused about it, and we can probably have discourse with them. There's other people who are using this very particularly in this time to, I think, sow dissent and to just really galvanize the base, as I said earlier. And we've seen this historically, and you brought it up, right? You know, communism as this overarching word that can be applied at any time. In the McCarthy era, we saw the devastations of that. The Red Scare, we saw that they literally made it illegal to be a communist, to be a part of the Communist Party. And they've never done this for white supremacist groups, mind you.
And adding to that too, there's the case in the 2010, 2011, where in Arizona, specifically the Tucson Unified School District, they had ethnic studies curriculum at the high school level that any student could take. It just happened that many of the students who would take what was Chicano studies there happened to be of Mexican descent, and there were also, of course, white students who would take this class, and essentially what ended up happening was that there were people who did not like that this was going on in their school, and it ended up getting banned. So in the same vein as what we're talking about critical race theory now, we're also attacking schools still to this day around teaching Africana studies, teaching Latino studies. It's in that same vein. It can be taught even without CRT. However, what CRT does is a lens that helps elevate those contexts.
100%. And I think if you take a step back and recognize kind of what's happening is, whether you recognize it initially or not, there is an inherent apprehension to changing anything that goes against the really Judeo-Christian values, right? Chicano studies, right, should be something very innocuous turned into an issue because it doesn't cater to who? The white population. Again.
What about the Alamo and all of, I thought it was, right?
Yeah, you know, I think you're funny. I like you. No, but no, like, right, anything that kind of falls outside that realm
Sure.
will oftentimes have an apprehension, and then there's a cultural struggle on how can we implement this and not, right, exclude white people, right? Because it always comes back to that. And none of these things are to exclude, but if we are going to be this melting pot, which I don't agree with the premise of that, right? This melting pot, there has to be cultural inclusion, right? And, right, like, I have issues with diversity and inclusion for way different reasons. But the purposes of that is to, again, people are trying to create this unified union. These people say that they want. Anytime there's an attempt made, though, they push back against it. Because whether they recognize it or not, sometimes low-key, some of these people, they don't actually want any of the values and tenets that America has laid its foundation on, right? Brotherhood, liberty, fraternity, right? I don't think they want brotherhood, because you then would want other groups of people within this country who helped build it, who are continually help building it, to be included in any way possible. You wouldn't be apprehensive to, like, diverse studies, right?
Right, unless their idea of brotherhood is only Irish people.
Yeah.
If. See, I think, and
That has to be investigated.
I get the, I get the sense of, I get the, I feel the optimism, right? I feel it. We're gonna just bring it to the light of more people so that they can see. Maybe it's just because I'm a sailor and I'm a slight cynic, but I've been of the belief since I was 10 years old that 7 out of 10 non-African American traditional Caucasian people are just going to be, or rather would exhibit, disdain and avarice to any colored anything. Am I wrong for thinking that that population is irredeemable?
I think it depends. Well, first, where is the stat of 7 out of 10 coming from? Is that a belief of yours you said, or
I will admit on camera that that's just 39 years of being black. I just completely made that up. I don't have it. Yeah, I do not. Thank you very much for that. You got to have your right. I don't have any. I have nothing that I could draw on to back that up. So I'll back away from that specific number and I'll just say majority.
Okay, so you feel that an overwhelming amount of white people would feel disdain towards anything that is people of color related.
Exactly, I do.
Okay.
I do. Not on the level of throwing bottles and using racial epithets in traffic or being responsible for dynamiting a church and killing 4 black girls or something like that. But, just definitely, I don't want Jaden learning about Pacific Islander Month. I don't want to live in a neighborhood where the Polish deli is replaced by a taco shop. Or, as we saw in Naperville, right, the kids make a wall after George Floyd and just put, Black Lives Matter unity, and parents came and ripped it down. I do believe that large sections of that population are irredeemable. And I wonder sometimes, and that's why I asked a specific question, am I wrong for thinking that?
I think that your experience as a black person validates for why you think that.
Because I like the idea of communities in America, all of them being represented and learned about, and I like that. It makes me very happy. I think a school would be very powerful if you walk in, right, and the flags of all nations are in the atrium. I think that that's great.
I have a problem with the flags in the atrium, but
you know what I'm saying. At least visually, you know what I mean. Like everybody.
That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation. Right. Not looking like the U.S. Embassy, but I do believe that I hold to the ideals like Nick articulated. Right. I believe that true, democratic, beautiful, shining city on a hill, right? To use John McCain's word, that lodestar. I believe that it's only possible when you can learn about Somali Americans and Uncle Jim, my Irish dad on the police force. But it doesn't seem like America sees anything other than my Uncle Jim as the template for residency and being a true American. And that's the only, so it's not an issue with critical race theory. I just, I would like to dig the optimism, right? I would like to have some of the optimism's a sandwich, and I wish I could, right? It's got mayo on it, and it's like, right? I just can't, right? I don't know.
You know what? So, I'm gonna make an assertion, and if anybody wants to have coffee and have me explain, because I'm not gonna get too deep into it, this is my assertion. I don't believe America in its current state is interested in having what their purported values are. I think that America, to exist as it is, requires exploitation and violence on people of color, not just domestically, but internationally.
Sure.
There was just a ruling that they allowed multinational corporations to use child labor, and they're getting away with it. This is places like Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and all over parts of Western Africa. They have, annexation of the land, and they're exploiting child labor.
That was at the UN level, right?
Yes.
That's right.
And
That's
to
right.
add to that too, I will echo what Nick is saying right now, because I do also believe that for America to exist on the premise of the values that they were built upon, they have to continue exploiting and oppressing people, whether it be domestically or internationally.
Right.
And I say that to, for me, I very much delve into my own roots in Central America right now. The U.S. is looking at providing economic aid to the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. However, that is predicated on those governments working in tandem with them to essentially slow further the migration of Central Americans.
Right.
However, we also have to look at, what is it that is working against people that forces them to migrate, because no one wants to migrate. No one just decides one day that, I'm going to go to another country.
Right.
So you also have to look at that, how are we exploiting people in other countries that then forces them to have to come to another nation that is essentially also exploiting their own, and then at the same time going to be further exploited by the fact that here in the U.S., we don't fairly compensate people for their labor.
Right. Period, point blank. What would America be? I guess maybe this will be the dreaming point of the conversation. What would America be if, was it community responsive trait, the opposite of CRT? Not the opposite, but there's critical race theory. What was the
There's
other?
culturally responsive teaching.
Okay, what would America be if education in America started off as culturally responsive teaching? What would America be if the changes that people articulate and we see take place now had started in 1776?
Well,
what would America be?
I will be honest and say that the way that culturally responsive teaching and learning as it stands
Mm-hmm.
it's a great starting point. It's definitely talking about diversity and inclusion and what equity means. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't hold people accountable for how is it that we address the issue of racism in the room, that elephant in the room. Because nowhere are we seeing, how is it that we're going to address the history of discriminatory practices in the U.S. It isn't explicitly stating that, educators are responsible for making sure that we're having those types of dialogues. So I see culturally responsive teaching as a great starting point to hit home the point about diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, in those conversations, we also have to ask ourselves, how are we teaching people about how are we teaching people to be anti-racist? And that's taking it a step further.
Well said, well said, well said. Not just being anti, being against it fully, right? There was a buzz term, we don't hear it that much anymore, about being an ally, right? And that was kind of like a last year thing. You both laugh when I say that. I once saw that being an ally would mean being rather committed to anti-racism fully. Is that a accurate statement, or is that just wishful thinking on the half of that? I mean,
I'll say, so for me, I don't necessarily like the word ally, and I've even used it in spaces because that's what people understand, and you're all going to meet people where they're at.
Sure.
But I much rather I want collaborators.
Okay.
I want accomplices. People like John Brown. If you don't know who John Brown, look him up, right? He armed slaves because he saw enslavement as such a moral, irredeemably reprehensible institution that he said it has to be ended.
sure.
Not in language, but he armed enslaved people. That's accomplished, right? People like Maud White, who was a white woman who organized with black women and fought very, very, intensely against the underpaying of black women in the threading and needle industries very early on. So people like that, who I don't need you to understand my struggle, I don't need your awareness. What are you doing with me? Are you helping me struggle against this? Or are we going to go back to what I brought up earlier, and that is the interest convergence principle, that if your interests aren't tied into it, it's not for you.
Right.
I need you to be committed to black liberation and what that looks like for me, and you get nothing out of it other than the fact that this is morally reprehensible, that people are being subjugated, dominated, occupied, right? I need you to be morally with me. It doesn't always have to have an interest for you. Like me, I'm an accomplice to people's struggles, and I don't benefit necessarily, right?
Right.
Now, I think I benefit actually ideologically from supporting, say, Palestine, right?
Sure.
But I am morally in support of Palestine and do work with Palestine activists and organizers because I believe unequivocally that they are an occupied people, right? So that's what we need to get at, what's in it for you, but what can we do morally speaking to this call and struggle?
I totally agree with. Yeah, that's well said because again, it should just be a no-brainer, for heaven's sakes. You shouldn't want anything, right? I don't want to live in. That's why I do the things that I like. I've seen you do so much. That's why I brought up the social justice committee when we started. But I believe that at least spiritually, a rising tide does lift all boats. I want my neighbor to be doing better, not because, right? If I want us all to be doing better, so there shouldn't be the promise of going to heaven potentially for one's actions should not be what spurs you. I mean, for heaven's sakes, who wants to see people chained up? And that's well said. I'm sorry.
And I think the other layer to that too now is that, I think when I think about the word allyship, I start to think more and more about people who only see issues in isolation that are just irrespective of one another. And I find that problematic because I think about, how it is that, for example, I do a lot of immigration work. Nick is very much predicated on, this idea of community safety and also, abolishing carceral systems. And those two things are intertwined because when we think about how, with ICE, with immigration customs enforcement, when we think about that and how that's tied to our incarceration system, that's just another pillar. It's
right.
It's intertwined. We think about how much this system is predicated on the count of black and brown bodies that they have. We dehumanize them, and we think about what the school to prison pipeline is, but we also think about I took a course actually a couple semesters ago where we were talking about the school to prison to deportation pipeline, because it's essentially all of it is intertwined. When we start criminalizing young black and brown people for something that is culturally embedded, culturally ingrained, but we don't have, again, going back to that cultural responsiveness, that cultural sensitivity, and acknowledging, you know, maybe this is a behavior or something that they experience that is, you know, that you might not understand, but you want to further explore it. But instead we find that, you know, we have people who are being criminalized even as young as preschool. And so we have to think about how these systems are intertwined, and that's why I say that the struggle needs to start being more intersectional as a result. And so when I think of allyship, I do start seeing more and more how people who label themselves an allies, not often, but I will say generally speaking, I'm finding that, you know, they are so, we have causes that we're passionate about, and I understand that, but then they fail to acknowledge how it is that other issues, other intersectional struggles are also included in these spaces, like, for example, you know, being that you might be someone who is from the LGBTQI plus community, but also possibly be someone who is Black or Indigenous, or someone whose migration status might be affecting their lived experiences. So we can't continue to see these struggles as isolated, because they all impact people in different ways and different layers. And so we need to start acknowledging that, and I think we need to start going beyond just what it means to be allies, and like Nick said, start being accomplices, collaborators, really starting to look at, you know, how is it that all of this intermingles, in order to really understand, you know, that we can't just focus on one issue and not look at how another issue also elevates that one or implicates that other issue as well.
This was an absolutely fantastic discussion with our dear friend Sandra Gonzalez of the Aurora Rapid Response Team and Mr. Nick Thompson, City of Aurora. Don't forget to support actions that help move the ball forward. This discussion was about critical race theory, but it was also about the other CRT?
The culturally responsive teaching.
Culturally responsive teaching. Please be able to distinguish between the two. Education is best. Become informed. Know what it is that you're speaking about. And let's do our part, I guess, collectively to try to make sure that we're building an inclusive society. You guys got anything that you want to say going out?
I will say, I think Sandra did an excellent job making the distinctions between critical race theory and cultural responsive teaching. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, one thing that I'll leave people on is that I subscribe to the idea racism is not about attitudes, that it's about power, right? If a white man wants to hang me, that's his problem. Right. He has the power to hang me, well, that's my problem, right? Right? And where does power come from in society? I argue it is the economic system in which that people can be excluded, included, and subjugated and repressed. So we need to reflect about that, right? So I'll leave it at that, and I just want people to reflect, right? You know, I'm part of an organization called Black Alliance for Peace. We're an anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace organization. And a lot of the work we do circles around these things peripherally, and I think it's an imperative to better understand the connections between struggles, right? Collective liberation, free one, free all, and that your interests are bound up in mine, but you should want to assist me in my struggle irregardless of that. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for having us on.
Well said.
I think what I'll leave people with too is, you know, just with what Nick just said, you know, thinking globally and acting locally, you know, just that intersection and how everything is just so connected. And I think that one of the ways that we can really start actively looking at what's going on in our communities is just starting to plug into what is going on around you. What is it that people unfortunately are having debates around that probably don't need to be debated, but people are confused. And just really start asking yourself, you know, how is it that you are benefiting from certain things that otherwise other people might not benefit from? How is it that you are shedding yourself of that, and how are you plugging yourself into the struggle? And also acknowledging to where it is that your capacity and your skills and talents are best utilized, so that way you can best plug yourself in. Because I think something too with just organizing and, you know, providing political education is also acknowledging too that we all have to be able to rest in order to continue with the struggle too, because that's something that I think merits having another conversation about organizing and what it means to take the time to really like take care of yourself. And so organizing, rest, cycle, and making sure that you are really reading up and informing yourself.